Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into this really fascinating story of mission, thinking about it as God's people joining in with God's big project, to renew everything.
Right, and the thing is, how that looks on the ground has changed dramatically over time.
Exactly. I mean, even in the Bible, right? You look at Revelation, those urgent calls, and then
Hmm.
Paul in First Corinthians giving very practical advice about engaging culture.
Worlds apart in feel, but part of the same underlying reality. Same mission, different expressions.
So if we want to get what mission means for us today, we can't just grab verses in isolation.
No, that would be totally ahistorical.
Yeah.
Like trying to understand a Tesla by only looking at a Roman chariot wheel. You're
Yeah.
missing, well, 2,000 years of history.
Right. We need to look back at how the church actually did mission, how
Yeah.
they understood it, how they lived it out.
And there's so much, there are successes, failures, things to learn from, things to maybe avoid repeating. It's all in that history.
Okay, so mission. My first thought often goes to missions. People going cross-culturally, planting churches where the gospel isn't known.
And that's been huge, especially the last couple of centuries. That idea of geographical expansion has really shaped how we tell the story.
Yeah, you think of historians like Stephen Neal or La Tourette. Their work maps out that incredible journey of Christianity across the globe.
Yeah.
It's impressive stuff.
Absolutely vital work, tracking that spread from the Roman Empire through Europe out to the whole world. It's a key part of the narrative.
But it's not the whole story.
Not quite. Focusing only on geography might make us miss the how and the why, the thinking behind it all.
Which brings us to another perspective. J.H. Bavinck, right? He suggested something different.
Yeah, Bavinck argued the real key isn't just the map, but the principles employed by the church in its conduct of mission work. Basically, the core ideas and strategies driving things in different eras.
Okay, so it's about the underlying mindset.
Precisely. And that leads to this idea of historical paradigms of mission. Thinkers like David Bosch, Alan Kreider, Lamin Sanneh, they've explored this.
Paradigms. So dominant ways of thinking and doing mission in specific times and places.
Exactly. Shaped by the culture, theology, the church's position in society.
Yeah.
Everything, really. Daryl Guter said, looking at it this way, transforms church history into mission history.
I like that. Not just what happened to the church, but how the church understood its core purpose.
Yes, how it acted on that purpose in the world.
Okay, so for this deep dive, we're zoning in on three big ones.
That's the plan. Three key paradigms. The early church, then Christendom, and finally the Enlightenment paradigm. Big shifts between each one.
All right, let's start at the beginning. The early church. What defined their approach?
Well, it obviously grew out of Judaism, but pretty quickly the message started taking root in the wider Greco-Roman world, the Hellenistic culture.
And the core message was,
Electrifying, really, that Jesus' victory, his resurrection, wasn't just a past event, but the start of something totally new. The end of cosmic history had begun, and the church was living in that new reality now in advance.
wow. So their mission was basically to announce that.
Announce it and live it.
Yeah.
Through everything, their words, sure, but also their actions, the way they structure their communities, the whole package.
And you mentioned earlier the historian Harnack talking about the attractive power of the local congregation.
Yes, that's so key for this period. It wasn't primarily about big, organized campaigns as we might think of them. It was the very existence, the quality of life in these Christian communities that was the main draw.
What made them so attractive then?
It was this radical contrast, wasn't it? The way they cared for the poor, the sick, how they broke down social barriers, rich, poor, slave-free, men, women, different ethnicities. That was unheard of in the Roman world.
A living alternative.
Exactly. This lived witness was incredibly powerful. And because they were so close to Jesus' time, they really saw themselves as carrying on his mission, living in the kingdom he'd inaugurated.
Which gave them this unique identity.
Yeah, they saw themselves as resident aliens. The Greek word was paraikoi, or sometimes even described as a third race, neither fully Roman nor fully Jewish in the old sense.
Their main loyalty was elsewhere.
To God's kingdom. And that inevitably created friction. It led to what some call a prophetic critical stance within culture. They were distinct, different.
And you could see that difference in practice.
Oh, definitely. Their opposition to pagan religion was clear, but also to things like the imperial cult worshiping the emperor, and even popular entertainment like the gladiatorial games or the theater, because they were so tied up with pagan worship and, frankly, immorality.
It wasn't just about belief, it was about everyday life.
Totally. I mean, there were debates in the 2nd century about whether Christians could even hold certain jobs.
Really? Like what?
Obvious ones, like making idols, but also things like being a carpenter, if you might be asked to work on a temple, or even a school teacher, if you had to teach pagan mythology.
Wow, that's taking it seriously.
Tertullian called idolatry the chief crime of mankind. It wasn't just one option among many. It was seen as fundamentally opposed to worshiping the true God, a deliberate rejection.
But that strong sense of identity, that countercultural stance, it didn't just happen, right? People weren't born into it.
No, absolutely not. It had to be intentionally cultivated. That's where the process of catechesis came in.
The teaching process for new believers.
Exactly, but it was way more than just learning doctrines. It could last up to 3 years. It was about deep formation, reshaping behavior to align with Jesus' life, reorienting beliefs around the gospel story, and building a deep sense of belonging within the church community.
Creating a distinct people.
Yes, people who embodied this attractive alternative way of life as a living contrast to the world around them.
So what did that exemplary life actually involve? What made them stand out so much?
Well, in many ways, they created what you might call a sociological impossibility for the time.
How so?
They deliberately broke down those rigid barriers. Wealth, gender, slave versus free, Greek versus barbarian. They lived out this radical gospel of love and charity, especially towards the vulnerable, the poor, orphans, widows, the sick, prisoners, even travelers.
And their moral lives.
Stood in stark contrast. Things like sexual ethics, faithfulness in marriage, self-control. They were known for it. Plus their hope, their joy, even when facing hardship, their unity, their generosity, simple lifestyles, forgiveness.
It sounds incredibly compelling.
There's a quote from the Canons of Hippolytus, basically saying the goal was for their lives to shine with virtue, not just to impress each other, but so that outsiders, the Gentiles, would see it, imitate them, and become Christians.
So it was intentionally missional.
Absolutely. Their very way of being was a form of witness.
Now, it's easy to picture them as kind of withdrawn, separate. But you mentioned they were also publicly subversive.
Yes, that's a common misconception, that they just retreated. But they refused to keep their faith private.
How was it public?
Well, their core confession, Jesus is Lord, was a direct challenge to the empire's Caesar is Lord. That was a political statement.
Refusing the emperor cult.
Exactly. That was a public act, often with dangerous consequences. And they called themselves ecclesia, which meant a public assembly, like a city council meeting, not a private religious club, which is how Rome tried to classify them.
So they saw themselves as a new kind of public body.
The beginnings of a new humanity, a new polis, under Christ's rule, not just a private spirituality group.
Okay, so beyond the witness of their lives, how did the message actually spread? How did evangelism happen?
Well, Eusebius, the historian, talks about itinerant evangelists, people who'd sell everything, travel to new places, preach and plant churches, kind of like the apostles did.
But then later monks took on that role.
Yes, that became a more common pattern later. But maybe the most significant method, certainly early on, was just ordinary Christians talking about their faith.
Just chatting about it?
Yeah, what some have called chattering the gospel in their homes, workplaces, marketplaces. We know this partly because critics complained about it. The philosopher Celsus mocked how effectively weavers and cobblers were spreading Christianity.
So everyday conversations were key. Were there other factors too?
Definitely. Martyrdom was, tragically, a powerful witness. Seeing people willing to die for their faith made others ask why.
That makes sense.
Miracles and exorcisms were also seen as demonstrations of the gospel's power over the old gods and forces. Tangible proof.
And for the educated classes.
You had apologists and teachers who engaged with Hellenistic philosophy, trying to show Christianity as the true fulfillment of reason and wisdom, though sometimes that led to maybe recasting the gospel in overly Platonic terms.
Okay, it sounds incredibly dynamic and faithful in many ways, but were there downsides, weaknesses in this early paradigm?
Oh, for sure. We need a balanced view. They weren't perfect.
Yep.
One issue was that gradual accommodation to the Greek worldview.
How did that affect things?
It sometimes led to downplaying history, the material world, maybe focusing too much on an otherworldly salvation instead of God's renewal of all things.
And internally?
Sometimes the focus shifted inward debates about church order or getting doctrine exactly right, which is important, but it could sometimes overshadow the outward missional focus.
Okay.
And the understanding of the Holy Spirit sometimes got disconnected from the mission aspect, becoming more about individual experience or specific gifts.
And you mentioned one other issue earlier.
Yes, tragically, the early treatment of Jewish people. It was a significant failure and sadly laid some groundwork for later anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
A real blind spot.
Okay. So from this often countercultural, dynamic early church, we move into a very different era, Christendom.
Yeah.
What drove that huge
It
shift?
was really a convergence of two big factors. First, that ongoing process of the gospel adapting, contextualizing itself within Roman culture and Greek thought, that was already shifting things.
Right, the theological landscape was changing?
But the second factor was the real earthquake, the conversion of Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century.
That changed everything.
Absolutely. Going from a persecuted minority, sometimes illegal, to suddenly having the emperor on your side, and eventually becoming the official religion of the empire by the end of that century.
I can't even imagine that transition.
It was massive. Legal status in 313 AD, state religion later on. The church exploded in size, wealth, influence. And inevitably, that meant a whole new way of thinking about mission.
From resident aliens to...
Citizens of a Christian empire. A completely different posture towards the world.
Now, Christendom gets a lot of criticism today, right, for compromising the mission by getting cozy with power.
Yes, and that critique is really important. Constantinianism, as it's often called, is rightly questioned for how political powers seem to dilute or even corrupt the church's witness.
But is it purely negative?
Well, Oliver O'Donovan makes an interesting point. He argues Christendom actually emerged from mission. In a way, the gospel proclaims Christ is Lord of all. Mission is announcing that. Initially, that led to conflict and martyrdom when challenging Roman power. But when that power acknowledged Christ, the church saw it, perhaps, as a victory for the mission.
Ah, okay. So the problem wasn't gaining influence itself.
Maybe not initially.
Yeah.
The bigger issue, arguably, was what happened next. Losing that sharp missional focus, becoming less willing to challenge the powers that be, even when they were acting unjustly.
The prophetic voice got quieter.
Exactly. The temptation to just manage the Christian society rather than constantly calling it back to the kingdom's values became very strong. The lines blurred between God's kingdom and earthly empires.
So a complex picture. Were there actual positive outcomes from the church having this cultural sway?
Yes, I think we have to acknowledge that. There was a genuine effort, flawed as it sometimes was, to shape society according to Christian values.
Like Constantine's reforms.
Right. Ending gladiatorial games, stricter laws on sexual offenses, better treatment for women, the poor, slaves, children, reforming justice. Peter Leithart talks about trying to infuse the evangel into the very structures of civil order.
Trying to make society more just and compassionate.
Exactly. And even non-Christian historians like Richard Tarnas acknowledged the church's pervasive influence later in Christendom on ethics, reason, human dignity, care for the needy, education, art, law.
Hospitals, schools.
Yeah, the list is long. There were tangible benefits from this widespread Christian influence, even if the motives and methods were sometimes mixed.
But as you said, there's the darker side too, the loss of that critical edge.
Definitely. The church became very closely tied to the political and the economic powers. Its identity got shaped more by society than by the Missio Dei, God's mission.
So it ended up upholding the status quo.
Often, yes. Instead of being a primary agent of transformation, it sometimes just legitimized the existing order. And that had big impacts on mission, both inside and outside the empire.
How did it affect mission within the so-called Christian lands?
Well, the focus tended to shift heavily towards pastoral care, maintaining the existing Christian population. The outward missional drive lessened.
Because everyone was assumed to be Christian already?
Largely, yes. There was a sense that the main missionary task within the empire was done. Plus, salvation itself started being seen more as something otherworldly, dispensed through the church's sacraments. Less emphasis on transforming this life in society.
Sort of an established church mentality.
Right. Roger Haight described it as becoming at peace with society, content with its internal life, assuming the missionary job was finished.
Okay, and what about mission beyond the borders of Christendom?
That's where things often get really problematic. The misuse of power, violence, coercion. It's a sad history.
Forced conversions.
Sadly, yes. It started maybe with compelling baptized people who'd strayed back into line. Sometimes twisting verses like Luke 14.23 compelled them to come in. But by the 6th century, figures like Pope Gregory the Great were authorizing force even against pagans. A huge departure from the early church.
And that set a precedent.
Unfortunately. Think of Charlemagne forcing the Saxons to be baptized in the 8th century. Brutal stuff done in the name of mission.
It's a stark warning about aligning faith with coercive power. But mission wasn't only that during Christendom, was it? You mentioned monasticism.
Absolutely. Monasticism is a much brighter thread in this story. Starting around the 5th, 6th centuries, think Benedict, the Irish monks, these movements became the real engine of mission for centuries.
Spreading Christianity across Europe.
Yes, reaching the Germanic tribes, Slavs, Scandinavians. Later, you had the Anglo-Saxon monks, and then from the 13th century, the Franciscans, Dominicans, later the Jesuits. These orders were central.
Figures like Patrick, Boniface.
Ulfilas, Martin of Tours, Columba, Augustine of Canterbury, Willibrord, Cyril, and Methodius, huge figures who systematically evangelized vast areas.
And there was a pattern to how it happened.
Stephen Neal noted one common pattern. Maybe an initial missionary martyr, resistance, then often a breakthrough when a ruler converted. That could lead to the whole tribe accepting baptism, then building churches, and the slow work of discipleship.
And these monks, even though they seemed withdrawn, they shaped the culture profoundly.
Hugely. David Bosch points out several things. They were often deeply respected, seen as more authentic Christians than the worldly clergy.
Their lifestyle was a witness.
Yes. Poverty, chastity, obedience, but also manual labor. They were vital in agriculture, reclaiming land after invasions. Monasteries were also hubs of learning, preserving texts, educating people.
Like islands of stability and knowledge.
Exactly. Providing hospitality, healthcare, charity, and they had this incredible long-term vision, tenacity, rebuilding after being destroyed, a spirituality of the long haul.
And later, in the 13th century, a new missionary energy with Franciscans and Dominicans.
Yes, a real renewal. Both orders were specifically founded with the conversion of unbelievers in mind. Francis himself went to Egypt to try and talk peacefully with the Sultan during a crusade.
A different approach.
And then you have Raymond Lull, a lay Franciscan, who had a remarkably advanced vision for cross-cultural mission-learning languages, understanding cultures, using reasoned argument, accepting martyrdom, way ahead of his time.
Now, this later period overlaps with the Age of Discovery, European expansion. How did that mix with mission?
Yeah, that's where things get really tangled again. Advancements in sailing, the drive for trade, it led to Europeans spreading across the globe.
And the church went with them.
Often, yes. Because the church-state link was still strong in places like Portugal and Spain, political expansion and mission became deeply intertwined. Mission often got redefined as Christianizing the people being colonized.
Following the flag, so to speak.
Pretty much. The Pope even divided the New World between Spain and Portugal, giving them the right of patronage, the duty to evangelize their territories.
Which must have looked like imperialism to the local people.
Absolutely. Political and religious authority seemed like the same thing. And while some brave missionaries protested the brutality, like Montesinos or Las Casas in the Americas, the conquest often happened alongside or even facilitated by missionary work. It's a very difficult legacy.
Did the organization of Catholic missions change later?
Yes. In the 16th, 17th centuries, the Vatican tried to take more direct control, establishing the Propaganda Fidei office, and the Jesuits became incredibly important missionary agents.
Jesuits like Xavier, Ricci.
Right, and they pioneered methods of cultural adaptation, like Ricci in China or De Nobili in India, arguing certain local customs weren't inherently religious and could be accommodated.
But that was controversial.
Hugely. The Chinese rights controversy went on for ages and was eventually condemned by Rome, which really damaged Catholic efforts in China for a long time. It even led to the temporary suppression of the Jesuits.
Meanwhile, back in Europe, the Reformation is happening. Still within Christendom, though.
Initially, yes. The Reformation shattered the religious unity of Western Europe. But the basic model of church-state connection continued in most Protestant areas, Lutheran, Reformed, Anglican states.
Cuius regio, ius religio, the ruler decides the religion.
Exactly. So still very much operating within that Christendom framework, just a fragmented version of it.
But did the Reformation sow seeds for a different understanding of mission eventually?
I think it definitely did in a couple of key ways. First, the theological recovery, grace through faith, scripture alone, priesthood of believers, Christ's kingship over all life, that laid a new foundation.
A different way of seeing God, salvation, the world.
Right. And second, the Reformation's focus on the individual's relationship with God started chipping away at that older, more corporate or tribal identity of Christendom. That opened up possibilities for mission understood more personally.
But did the Reformers themselves actively do much cross-cultural mission? It's debated, isn't it?
It is. Compared to contemporary Catholics or later Protestants, their direct involvement in missions outside Europe looks limited. Critics like Cardinal Bellarmine even accuse them of only trying to convert other Christians.
Why the limited focus, then?
Various reasons are suggested. Maybe theological ideas about the Great Commission being fulfilled by the apostles, the sheer chaos of the Reformation Wars consuming energy, rejecting monasticism, which had been the main missionary force, lacking the state backing and sea power that Spain and Portugal had.
So we shouldn't judge them by later standards.
Probably not. Bosch argues their main mission field was reforming the church and society in Europe. Think of Calvin's work in Geneva shaping public life according to the gospel. That was their primary focus.
But there was a group that radically challenged the whole Christendom model.
Yes, the Anabaptists.
Yeah.
They completely rejected the church-state setup. For them, the true church was voluntary, a pilgrim community, inherently missionary, expecting persecution.
A very different vision.
Totally. They argued Europe was a mission field, that every believer was responsible for mission, and the Great Commission was definitely not finished. Radical ideas then, but very influential later.
Which leads us towards pietism. How did that movement shape mission?
Pietism arose in the 17th to 18th centuries, partly as a reaction against what felt like dead orthodoxy in Protestant churches. It stressed personal conversion, heartfelt devotion, living faith, and, crucially, evangelistic zeal.
More focus on individual experience.
Yes, and that naturally led to a renewed focus on mission. But for pietists, it wasn't the state's job, or even primarily the institutional church's job. It was the responsibility of every converted individual.
So mission becomes more grassroots.
Exactly. It spurred the creation of voluntary societies, prayer groups, missions supported by ordinary believers. Think of the Methodists, the Danish Halle mission, and especially the Moravians under Zinzendorf. Incredible missionary energy came out of pietism.
What was the driving force, the key idea?
A strong emphasis on individualism, on saving individual souls. Baving pointed this out.
And that was both a strength and a weakness.
Yes. Strength. It unleashed huge energy, freed mission from state control, motivated countless people. Germany became a major missionary center. The Moravians had an impact way beyond their numbers. Incredible dedication.
The weakness.
Sometimes it narrowed the focus just to individual conversion, maybe neglecting broader social or cultural transformation. Less emphasis on the kingdom impacting all of life, and sometimes maybe devaluing the role of the visible church structure.
Okay, so after pietism's influence, we hit the third major paradigm, the Enlightenment. What's the big story here for mission?
The defining factor is the massive cultural shift in Europe towards secular humanism. The 18th century Enlightenment wasn't just one philosophy, it became a whole competing worldview, a comprehensive vision fundamentally challenging the gospel's view of reality.
A new faith for the West.
In essence, yes. Secular humanism took over as the dominant belief system, prioritizing human reason, individual autonomy, and progress through science and technology. It aimed to transform civilization on its own terms.
And that clashed directly with Christian faith.
Fundamentally, it was naturalistic, no room for God acting in the world. Rationalistic human reason is the only path to truth. Optimistic about human goodness, rejecting sin and dependence on God. Focused on human freedom as the ultimate goal.
A secularized version of salvation, almost.
You could see it that way. Progress towards a human-created paradise on earth through science. And this wasn't just abstract. It got embedded in revolutions, legal systems, education.
So how did the church in the West cope with this? Being in a culture now dominated by a rival faith?
It was tough. The old Christendom assumptions where Christian belief was the default just didn't work anymore. And frankly, the church struggled to adapt.
Why?
That long history of being dominant maybe made it hard to critically engage with this new worldview. Faith started looking implausible, maybe irrational, pushed to the private sphere.
And how did churches respond?
You saw different reactions. Some liberal traditions tried to accommodate Christianity to Enlightenment ideas, often losing core beliefs in the process. Even more conservative evangelical traditions sometimes reacted by narrowing the gospel's scope primarily to individual private salvation, maybe neglecting its public, world-transforming claims.
So understanding mission to Western culture became harder.
Generally, yes. The church often failed to see it as a clash of fundamental worldviews. Mission within the West often got reduced just to evangelism, trying to win individuals back.
Though Christian influence didn't disappear entirely.
No, absolutely not. There was still much vitality and positive, maybe unintentional influence on society. But the overall trend under humanism's pressure was decline in the West.
Okay, but here's the paradox. While mission within the West seemed challenging, the 19th and 20th century saw this huge outpouring of mission from the West to the rest of the world.
Exactly. The modern missionary movement, it's this incredible contrast. While grappling with secularism at home, there was this unprecedented wave of resources and people going overseas.
A complex movement, though.
Hugely complex, as Leslie Newbegin said, full of both unspeakable horrors and great achievements. We have to hold both realities.
You mentioned Christianity seemed very Western at the start of the 19th century.
Largely, yes, concentrated in Europe and the Americas. So many felt this strong biblical call to reach the ends of the earth.
Which led to this massive Protestant effort.
Yes, particularly from Britain and North America into Africa, Asia, Latin America. For much of this period, mission basically meant cross-cultural work in the Third World. That became the dominant understanding.
But carrying the gospel inevitably meant carrying Western culture, too.
Inescapably, the gospel always takes cultural form. The problem wasn't that inherently. The problem was the attitude that often went with it.
Meaning?
Two things, really. First, the West felt culturally superior because of its scientific and technological power. Second, Christianity had been wrapped up in Western culture for so long, it was hard to separate the gospel message from its Western packaging.
They couldn't tell the difference.
Often, neither the missionaries nor the recipients could easily distinguish. As Andrew Walls put it, Christianity and the West seemed welded together. So Western ways thinking, social structures, even music or dress, often got imposed along with the faith.
Dismissing local cultures.
Sometimes, yeah, without enough discernment about what was genuinely incompatible with the gospel versus what was just different.
And then there's the link with colonialism and imperialism, especially later on.
Yes, particularly in the late 19th, early 20th century, the scramble for Africa, consolidating power in Asia, missions got tied up with that whole enterprise.
Different from earlier colonialism.
Earlier Catholic colonialism had more of a theocratic goal, Christian rule. This later phase was more driven by economics, resources, national power products of Enlightenment thinking, in a way.
Livingstone's 3 C's, Christianity, commerce, civilization.
Right. A well-intentioned vision for some, maybe, but it shows how intertwined these things became in people's minds.
It's a legacy we're still grappling with.
Absolutely. Valid criticisms exist about missions accommodating colonialism, contributing to cultural loss. Missionaries were people of their time, often carrying assumptions of superiority.
But it wasn't all negative.
No. We also have to remember the genuine love, the desire to abolish slavery, promote health and education, fight poverty. Much good came from it. And many missionaries were critical of colonial abuses, advocating for local people.
So a balanced view is needed.
Essential. They were implicated in colonialism, yes, but their primary motives were often focused on the people they served, spiritually and physically.
And those motives weren't just colonial. There were strong biblical drivers, too.
Definitely. Verkuhl lists several. Obedience to Christ's commands, love for God and neighbor, desire for God's glory, doxology, hope in Christ's return, eschatology, urgency about salvation, even personal blessing.
David Bosch also analyzed the motives.
Yes, he highlighted 3 key ones. First, obedience to the Great Commission, Matthew 28, became huge in this era, thanks to William Carey's influence. Maybe sometimes applied legalistically, but still powerful. Love for Christ and people. Real compassion, though, as we said, sometimes tainted by that Western superiority complex, becoming patronizing.
And third,
millennial expectations.
Yeah.
Different views about the end times, postmillennial optimism about Christianizing the world before Christ returns, or premillennial urgency to save individuals before tribulation. Both fueled missionary action, just in different ways.
Okay, so with fragmented churches after the Reformation and the Enlightenment weakening state ties, how did this huge movement actually get organized? Where did the structure come from?
That's where the voluntary missionary societies come in. Bosch called them an astonishing phenomenon of the 19th century.
Because the old structures weren't there.
Exactly. No central church authority like the Pope for Protestants, and the state wasn't funding missions in the same way. So committed individuals banded together.
Starting with William Carey.
His Baptist Missionary Society in 1792 is often seen as the first. Then loads followed. These societies recruited, trained, funded, and sent missionaries, supported by donations. They provided the engine room.
But this wasn't universally popular. People debated these societies.
Oh yeah, big time. Still do, in some ways. Supporters said they filled a gap the churches weren't filling. They were flexible, fostered cooperation.
Critics
argued they weren't biblical mission is the church's job. Worried they detracted from the church's own missionary nature, maybe led to fragmentation, lack of accountability. New Beacon called their separation from church oversight a calamity. Bavinck argued for reforming the church itself, not creating parallel bodies.
Where do they stand today?
Still central to a lot of mission work, but the relationship with churches, funding models, global partnerships, it's all constantly evolving and being discussed.
So, wrapping up this Enlightenment paradigm, it seems clear it's no longer fully adequate.
Definitely not. The massive growth of the church in the non-Western world, the decline in the West, the end of colonialism, the whole landscape has shifted. We need to rethink mission again for the 21st century.
Okay, what an incredible sweep of history. We've gone from the early church with that attractive community life
Right, living as distinct resident aliens.
through the long, complex era of Christendom, church and power intertwined for good and ill.
A mixed bag, definitely. Shaping culture, but also compromising witness.
And then into the Enlightenment era, secular challenges at home, but this huge explosion of cross-cultural missions tied up with Western dominance and colonialism.
Yeah, that ambiguity of the modern missionary movement.
Understanding these shifts, these paradigms, it really gives you perspective on mission today, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You see how history shapes our assumptions, often without us even realizing it. It helps us ask better questions about how we do mission now.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening. Given all this history, the strengths and the weaknesses we've talked about, what does faithful, effective mission look like now?
That's the big question. What do we keep from these past approaches? What needs adapting? What needs leaving behind entirely?
Lots to think about. How do we participate in God's mission of renewal in our own time and place? Something definitely worth mulling over after this deep dive.